I'd like to welcome Dr. Yousef Jabareen. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Where's the response? Yeah. Well, I would like definitely to start by thanking the Swiss-Palestinian Association for organizing this panel, and would definitely would like to thank Miko for also taking the time and share this panel and give his excellent presentation about the situation back in Palestine. And I would like also to thank you for not just for your courage and your thorough understanding of the situation, but also for highlighting some of the important discussion that usually is not being heard, neither here in Europe nor in the US. So I hope that the message was clear on that. And I think Miko has covered very deeply the general situation in Israel-Palestine, which would leave me some time to go more in depth on the issue of Palestinians in Israel. That maybe I think was maybe the general title of this panel. And sometimes I feel kind of that this group of Palestinians is the forgetting Palestinians. And I think Ilan Pape has a new book about the forgetting Palestinian, the Palestinian who sometimes Palestinians themselves, but also the general world has forgot about them. And I will take the first bite of my presentation to talk about this group, which is basically my small community back home, and then move in the second part to discuss the situation back home in general, and then basically communicate with the last issues that Miko has addressed. In the first slide, I have tried to make the differentiation between the different Palestinian groups. But by saying different Palestinian groups, I refer mainly to the political and legal situation. We are definitely one people, and these different groups is basically the creation of the Nakba, the creation of the 1948 catastrophe of the Palestinian people. And as you will see here today, we are about 11 to 12 million Palestinians. Within Israel proper, with the 1948 borders, today the Palestinian native community is about 1.5 million, constituting around 1/5 of the population within Israel. Now, who are those Palestinians? We are the indigenous, we are the remaining indigenous Palestinian people who survived the Nakba, who survived the 48 war, who were not expelled from their homeland. And an important fact to remember about the history of Palestinians, that only 15%, about 10 to 15% of the Palestinian people survived the war in their homeland. So when Israel was created back in 1948, only 15% of the Palestinians who used to live in the area in which Israel was established survived the war. Back then, about 160,000 back in 1948. How many Palestinians were before 48? How many Palestinians? About 1,200,000 or 300 million. What happened with the rest of the Palestinians? So as I said, 160,000 remained in the border of the newly established state. What happened with the rest? They became refugees. either in the West Bank or in the adjacent Arab countries. This is the issue of the refugees that still going on for about 70 years. The second group that I refer to is Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Since 1967, under the Israeli military occupation, about 2.5 million in Gaza, and about 2.5 million in the West Bank, and about 2 million in Gaza. And there is also the group of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, that they have also some kind of like special status. Because back in 1967, Israel decided to annex East Jerusalem against definitely international law. And Israel granted Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, who survived the war, some kind of like Israeli residency, but not citizenship. So today we are speaking about 300,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem who have some kind of like a shaky status. They were not granted citizenship as Palestinians back in 1948, but they were annexed with keeping some kind of like shaky status of being a resident of Israel, some kind similar maybe to the American green card. So they even not entitled to vote for the parliament, although they hold basically Israeli residency. So when addressing the different Palestinian group from a political and legal perspective, we could identify basically 4 different groups: Palestinians in Israel, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinian refugees. And I think the main maybe point about these 4 groups, about all the Palestinian people, that each of these groups has been historically denied the basic rights, the basic human rights. Palestinians in Israel have historically been denied the basic right of being equal citizens within Israel. And I will address this more deeply soon. Palestinians in East Jerusalem, who have been under occupation from 1967. And in this status, they are not citizens and they don't enjoy equal rights, and they were annexed to Israel against international law. And there's the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza denying the basic right of self-determination. And the Palestinian refugees, today about maybe 5 to 6 million, who are still denied the right to return, a right that was recognized by the General Assembly of the UN in the Resolution 194. So as I said, I will focus maybe a little bit in the beginning about the issue of Palestinians in Israel, a native community constituting about 1/5 of the population. Today, we're about 1.5 million, so our number has doubled since 1948, about 9 to 10 times. And interestingly, over 90% of our community, again, within Israel, live in entirely Arab towns and villages. So there is a clear housing separation and residency separation within Israel when it comes to Jews and Arabs. And I think the main issue has been that the Israeli policy toward its Palestinian citizens has been a policy that look at them as a security threat, treated with a great deal of hostility by state authority and the Jewish majority alike. We're speaking about a very vulnerable socio-economically and very poor community, and also very young community. But I think this number, about 50% under the age of 18, I think it's today right for the entire Palestinian people. The entire Palestinian people is young. And I think that 50% of our people is under the age of 18. Just examples that number of families under poverty line is over three times more than Jewish families. Average earning is 2/3 that of the Jewish citizens. Unemployment rate is way higher than that of the Jewish community. And only 31% of Arabs qualifying for university acceptance on the matriculation exam compared to 76% of Jews. And additional interesting numbers about this community, that 25% of our community are basically internally displaced persons, internal refugees. Internal refugees, in the meaning that it's right that Israel granted them Israeli citizenship, but Israel wouldn't allow them, even though they were still within Israel and they were granted Israeli citizenship, Israel wouldn't allow them to go back to their original villages and homes. That's how we see this terms of present absentees. So many of our communities are present absentees. What does that mean, present absentees? That according to the citizenship law, we were regarded as a presence and we were giving Israel citizenship. But according to other laws, we were granted as refugees, as absentees, and our property basically was confiscated. Until 1966, our community was under military rule, and we were denied basic rights of movement, of freedom of expression, and there were also some bloody events in our relationship with the State of Israel. The Kafar Qasim massacre back in 1956, the Land Day protests back in 1976, and the 2000 October events where 13 Palestinian citizens were shot to death by the Israeli security forces. When I try to analyze their legal status, and I'm originally a lawyer. I graduated from the Hebrew University, and then I went to the law school at Georgetown to do my doctorate, and my focus was human rights and constitutional rights. So basically, my analysis here would be more from a human rights perspective and the legal perspectives. I would basically mention 4 main forms of exclusion that are experienced by the Arab Palestinian community in Israel. The first one, I think, maybe is the most important one. And I say that this is the most important one because sometimes people just don't think about it and they are not aware of it. This is the fact that the Israeli legal system includes tens of laws that by definition give special arrangement and special privileges, but only for Jewish citizens. By definition, the law itself will give the special arrangement only for Jews. Maybe the well-known example that people know about it is that law of return. That if you are a Jew or your family of a Jew, you have an automatic right to come to Israel and claim citizenship. Or the symbols of the state, that they are exclusive Jewish Zionist symbols. And these are by laws. But there are, I could give you the examples here, but there are also laws on the land housing and land ownership. The special status that the legal system would give for the Jewish Zionist institutions within Israel. Although these institutions openly say that they serve only the Jewish community. Laws in education and culture that would recognize the collective identity and the collective heritage and the collective history, but only of the Jewish community. And no similar recognition exists when it comes to the Arab Palestinian minority. Similarly, law on religion. The law that would recognize elected religious leadership within, but only within the Jewish community, and no similar recognition for the Arab community, whether they are Muslims or they are Christians. Sometimes even simple daily issues, like now we are in the holy month of Ramadan. And the end of the holy month of Ramadan start Eid al-Fitr. There is no even religious authority within Israel from the Muslim community that have the authority to declare when is the Eid, when is the feast. So we look only at the Palestinian authority or to the Arab world to basically have the decision if it's Eid or not. And that's because there is no recognition of an official religious leadership of the community. And lastly, the issue of political participation. It's the fact that the Israeli law itself says that you can't be elected to the Knesset, to the Israeli parliament, if you work to disqualify Israel and to negate Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. I mean, this is the terminology that was adopted by the law. I guess all of us have heard now the presentation of Miko Peled. I think if I make the same presentation several times, I might run in danger of being disqualified from running to the parliament. Although I wouldn't commit any criminal act or something, but the fact that by itself that I discuss these issues and being very critique of Israel's definition as a Jewish state, I might run into the possibility of being disqualified from running to the Knesset. So what we learn from these laws, and again, I have counted at least 50 laws. At least 50 laws. What we learn from them? The main thing that we learn from this is that there is no equal citizenship in Israel. When we speak about democracy, the basic principle that we learn about democracy is equality, is equal citizenship, that all citizens are equal. By law, by definition. I mean, in a practice, things might be a bit different. Like, African Americans in the US, the law promised them equality after the civil rights movement. In a practice, they are still suffer from discrimination. And that's the case maybe with other minorities. But at least the basic principle of any state that declare about itself that it's a democratic state, it's the equal citizenship. The legal system in Israel does not recognize equal citizenship as a principle. And this is the immediate result of these tens of laws that would give basically this special status for Jewish citizens and maybe Jews around the world, while we, the indigenous Palestinian community, are denied comparable arrangement or comparable rights. So in fact, that's a clear classification of the Israeli citizenship. There is, first-class citizenship enjoyed by Jewish citizens and could be enjoyed by, a Jewish immigrant to Israel who just claimed citizenship 2 days ago. And I mean it, 2 days ago that immigrated to Israel from Russia or from other country, and now he gets the Israel citizenship, and because he's a Jew, so he's entitled to all these arrangements about land ownership, about religious rights, about the symbols of the state, about identity and language and heritage. And if you are a non-Jews, mainly the Arab Palestinian community, you are in inferior status. It's a second or third or fourth class citizen. So when we talk to people around the world, and we say that we reject the idea of Israel being defined as a Jewish state, and that and that if you are a true Democrat and you are a true human being, you must reject such an idea, not just as a legal principle, but also as a moral principle. So I reject the idea of Israel being a Jewish state because for me it's clear that this idea means that I will be in an inferior status in my homeland. In my homeland. How can I do that? How can I do that? I mean, anybody of you would accept the fact that he would be looked at as an inferior citizen, as an inferior human being in his homeland? And this is exactly why we say that Israel cannot identify itself in one hand as a Jewish state and on the other hand as a democracy. Because in a Jewish state you give superior status for Jewish citizens. But if you are a democracy, you are supposed to give equal status to all citizens. Especially if they are the native, the indigenous inhabitant of the land. So here, in the slides, I'll be happy to share with. I try to give some examples of these specific laws. I wouldn't go, into details in my presentation here, but these are, some examples. So that was the first level of exclusion by law, by definition. However, even in other areas that you cannot identify specific law that would create discrimination, there is no equality as well. That's the socio-economic discrimination. That's the institutionalized discrimination resulted by discriminatory decision-making process, the underrepresentation in all levels, discrimination allocation of resources, discrimination allocation of land. It's basically the continued process of confiscating land of Palestinians. Arabic in Israel. It's legally defined as a national language, although there's an attempt to change that. Its status in daily life is far inferior to that of Hebrew. I visited Canada a few months ago, and in Canada, as you know, French is considered as an official language alongside English. Now, I mentioned Canada because the French-speaking community there is also about 20-25%, maybe similar to Palestinians in Israel. And whenever I go to the Supreme Court, to the Parliament, to any public federal office, you will see that both languages are respected, and you could speak in both languages in all the public sphere, but not in Israel. The public sphere is exclusively in Hebrew. So in the Knesset, for example, if I want, I can speak in Arabic, but nobody could understand. So it doesn't make any sense to speak in Arabic because there is no translation. And the Jewish community, they don't study Arabic, so they don't know Arabic as well. Arab education in Israel. Arab schools have their own curriculum. However, it's designed and supervised by the Ministry of Education. And it's a very absurd situation in which, for example, before being elected to the Knesset, I was teaching at the University of Haifa. So I would design my own classes for my students, mainly Jewish students. I would have like 200 students that I would design the content of the class and the material. But now when my kids are in schools, I can't even change one word in their curriculum. Not even one word. Why? Because everything is controlled by the Ministry of Education, and there is a clear policy of denying the history, the heritage, the identity of our community, of our people, and basically all the content is decided by the Ministry of Education, and there's a clear policy of fostering the Jewish heritage and history even in the Arab schools. I mean, these functions, just to give you the differences between our percentage, which is the upper level, and then the actual allocation of resources that we get from different ministries. And these are some statistics about the differences, socio-economic gaps between Arabs and Jews. And there is also the issue of what I call it societal discrimination, hate speech and racism in our daily life. It's the daily experience of our youth to get jobs in the Jewish areas, mainly in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, or to get apartment, to being rejected just because you're an Arab or just because your name is Muhammad. And that definitely has, resulted in, was one of the reasons for the inferior socio-economic situation of the community, especially that the government is not investing in our community, not in housing projects, and not in industrial areas. The issue of racism is becoming a main source of worry for our community. For example, a study that was conducted at Haifa University showed that 75% of Jewish pupils think that Arabs are ignorant, uncivilized, and dirty, and the majority, not even 2/3 of Israeli Jews think that Arabs should be encouraged to immigrate from Israel. In the last few years, we have witnessed many international reports about the situation of Palestinians in Israel that recognize the inferior status of the community. I here, refer to the UN, AU, and even US Department of State issued reports supporting these claims, noting the institutional, legal, and societal discrimination faced by Arab citizens of Israel. And as I said, the combination of discriminatory laws along with notable socio-economic gaps between the two groups have resulted in two classes of citizenship in Israel. Those who are full, equal, and worthy partners in the state, and those who are second or third class citizens. And when we try to think about some of the main ideas or main demands that we raise as a national native minority within Israel, I could share with you maybe the main 10 points that we would usually emphasize in our political platform and in our communication within the international community, but also definitely within Israel itself. So the first point would be recognizing and protecting the Arab minority in Israel as a national and indigenous minority with a distinct collective identity, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, and culturally. Guaranteeing full equality of rights on a civil and national basis. Guaranteeing equal status for Arabic in all areas of the public sector alongside Hebrew. I give the example of like French in Canada, for example. 4, granting Arabs the right to self-steer their own educational, culture, and religious institutions similar to the current status of the Orthodox Jewish educational system. So when it comes to minority within the Jewish public, they have some kind of like self-steering of their cultural issues and educational issues, but not when it comes to the Arab minority. 5, guaranteeing full and democratic participation and effective representation in governmental, administrative, and decision-making bodies. 5 is important because it's important for me to emphasize that it's true that we have the right to vote, and there are authentic Arab Palestinian representative of our community in the parliament. However, this representation is kind of like a talking representation. Because we have never got any political influence through this representation. We have never been part any of the Israeli government or any of the political decision-making process. So we are basically excluded from that process. To the extent that some in our communities have been questioning why we are taking part in the election. And I think this is maybe what Shirine was referring to when she said, I wouldn't use the word traitors, but some people would think that we should boycott and not taking part in this kind of like, being a talking representative of the community. However, we still believe that it's important for us to try our best and to use all possible ways to protect the rights of our community, including through participating in the election. So when we're in the election, we're maybe at least understanding what's going on, understanding, behind the scene discussions, knowing about possible plans that the government is preparing, but also we are leaders of the community on the ground, on the field, in demonstrations, in different protests that we do, but also we represent our community in the international arena and bring their voices to Europe, to the UN, to the US. So sometimes as a member of the Knesset, sometimes I feel that my role is not about being in the Knesset. It's less important being in the Knesset because my political influence is extremely limited. But maybe my political leadership is more about, being in the field with our community, leading the protest and representing our case, vis-a-vis the Jewish public and vis-a-vis the international community. So sometimes when I speak at the Knesset, I'm not necessarily worried about the few members of the Knesset that are in the, in that session, because my speeches are broadcasted, to the general public. So I'm worried about, the general public and trying to address the general public from this position. 6 is guaranteeing special allocation of national material resources to address socio-economic gaps. This is the issue of institutionalized discrimination that we have been facing since the establishment of the state. One of the leading examples is the fact that Israel has confiscated over 50% of the land that we used to own in the aftermath of 48, not the refugees' lands. But even the land that were recognized in our ownership as Palestinian citizens, Israel has confiscated over 50% of that land, which resulted in a situation in which we live in a crowded and poor, entirely Arab communities, and the land that we own today as Arabs in Israel is less than 3.5%. So within Israel, in the borders of 1948, Palestinians today, we own less than 3.5%. 7, appropriately recognizing the Arab community in state symbols. So we are arguing that the symbols cannot be an exclusive symbols of the majority group. Guaranteeing equality and fairness in immigration and citizenship for all citizens and residents. That definitely an issue that would bring in the issue of the rights of the Palestinian refugees. Whenever I travel outside Israel and meet my fellow Palestinians who are refugees, Shirine, Firas, and others, I just think about this, absurdness situation in the Israeli legal system, in which that if you have a family relationship, if you happen to have a family relationship to a Jew in Argentina, in Brazil, in Europe, you have an automatic right to come to Israel and immediately have Israeli citizenship and live in Israel. But if you are a Palestinian and your family might be still even there, like in my case, I have extended family in the West Bank, I have extended family in the US, I have extended family, all of them are refugees in Europe. I have no legal opportunity to bring them to live with me. And since 2003, there was an amendment to the Israeli citizenship law that Palestinian youth are not even allowed to bring their spouses to live with them in Israel. And I know thousands of cases of that one spouse is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, the other spouse from the West Bank, and he or she cannot unite within Israel. And they have to decide whether to live outside Israel or just to split. And you know, one story of one of my closest friends who studied with me in the US and fell in love with the Palestinian woman from Bethlehem. They finished, I think, 2005, 2006, their study, want to go back. He went back to Israel, she went back to Bethlehem, and they were not able to live together in Israel. I mean, it's absurd, but that's the reality of thousands of families. And after a few years of trying and going to the Supreme Court, blah, 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 nothing worked. So they went back to the US. That was their only possibility to live together as one family. And that's still going on. That's not something that's still going on these days. And by the way, this case has reached the Supreme Court of Israel twice, in 2006 and 2012. In both cases, there was major split within the Israeli Supreme Court. It was majority of 6 to 5. 6 to 5, very close. And the 5 who were in the minority says that it's a clear discrimination. There is the right for these people to unite with their family. However, there were 6 justices who would still adhere to the government position, and they basically refrained from striking down the law. And I wanted to emphasize this split of the Supreme Court because that was a clear racist law. And we thought that our last resort would be, Supreme Court. It's the Israeli Court of Justice, that's the name, the High Court of Justice. And if you can't protect your rights in the Knesset, so your last resort would be the Supreme Court. And if you lose there, what you have else? Nine, recognizing the historical rights of the Arab minority to its homeland, addressing internal refugees, and recognize communities and land rights and the claims. These are issues that I have addressed them. It's basically saying that it's not just about fixing these discriminatory laws, but it's also about recognizing the historical rights of Palestinians, whether they are citizens or not citizens, whether they are in the West Bank or they are refugees. There is the issue of the historical right, and you have to address these historical rights. 10, recognizing and protecting the Arab minority special relationship to the other Palestinians and Arabs in the region. It's the issue of allowing us to communicate with our people, with our Palestinian people and with the Arab world, and not basically recognizing and not basically treating this relation as if we are communicating with enemies, because we are communicating with our own people and extended people, but this is not recognized. So basically these are 10 demands that would summarize I would say the human rights struggle of the Arab Palestinian community within Israel. I would close by saying that it might be very symbolic to hear Miko presentation and my presentation in 2017, exactly 100 years after the Balfour Declaration. 100 years. Why I'm saying that? Because when I read the Balfour Declaration, what was it about? It was about promising the Jews Palestine as their homeland, their national homeland. Now, back in 1917, 100 years ago, Jews in the area of historical Palestine were less than 10%, maybe less than 5%. So think about this declaration, this kind of like declaration or promise that you promise Jews in historical Palestine who are less than 10% Palestine as their homeland. And when referring to the Palestinians in historical Palestine, the Balfour Declaration didn't mention them as Palestinians, but as what? As non-Jews. So the Balfour Declaration was about promising homeland for Jews who were tiny minority, and about the majority, the Balfour Declaration referred to them as non-Jews. It said that non-Jews have civic and religious rights. So it's basically 100 years ago, the attitude was to try to promise Jews the historical Palestine as their national homeland, and those who are not Jews, they have only civic and religious rights. They don't have national rights. This is exactly what we are witnessing these days under this Netanyahu government. Netanyahu has been in power since 2009, and this is exactly, I think, what he is basically declaring and what he is basically doing on the ground. Saying basically that there is no Palestinian people, there is no national rights for the Palestinian people, the exclusive right for self-determination is only for Jews, and that's the new nationality law. It says clearly that there's an exclusive right for self-determination for Jews in historical Palestine. And those who are not Jews, Palestinian people, very soon they will be the majority, have civil and religious rights, some kind of like self-ruling, limited self-ruling in the major Palestinian cities, Ramallah, Jenin, and Bethlehem. So it's about one state. Definitely not a two state. It's about one state, but it's not a democratic state. It's not a binational state. It's a clear state of apartheid. It's of apartheid and of occupation. Because I think that the word occupation is even, the level of the occupation, I would say even harder. It's one stage of oppression which is beyond apartheid. Because it's not just about segregation. It's about segregation, it's about apartheid, but it's also about military rule. And about denying the Palestinian people their basic right of self-determination. So I would close by saying, when you think about the issue of Palestinians, it's extremely important to think about at least these three levels of discussion. The issue of Palestinians in Israel and their right of full equality on the civil and the national level. The issue of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and self-determination. And the issue of refugees. That's why when I think about a solution of two-state based on 1967, which has been, the solution offered by the Arab League since 2002, but there is no partner in Israel for such a solution. When I think about 1967 borders, I know that Palestinians will be left, even if we fulfill this solution, with only 22% of their historical land. Only 22% of their historical land. So how come that Palestinians should agree to that? And they are agreeing, at least, according to the Palestinian leadership, with that. I think the only way to understand this acceptance of two-state solution based on 1967 borders, which would leave Palestinians with less than a quarter of their historical land, is by saying that this is only a part of the solution. And the next stage would be simultaneously to guarantee all these equal rights for Palestinians in Israel, including historical rights and the restitution of land and etc., but also the issue of the refugees and guaranteeing their right of return. So we have to see the Palestinian discourse about two-state solution as within this broader picture of the different situation of Palestinians within Israel, West Bank and Gaza, and the refugees. I understand that when I see things on the ground, people might say that it's maybe a long walk to go. But as I just told you, I studied, the African American Civil Rights Movement, and I think that if you ask an African American back in the 50s or in the 60s, that you will transfer the legal system and you might have even African American presidents, that would be something that nobody will take it seriously, but that happened. And if you ask Nelson Mandela when he was in jail, that very soon he will be released and he will be the president of Democratic South Africa, nobody will think that this will happen. So I think if we look at the experience of the history, so the experience of the history would teach us that rights should be fulfilled. And this is the reason why Miko and I are here, and we will continue to address you and the international community until the rights of our people are fulfilled. Thank you.